The Birth of Metaphysics, Parmenides, Plato, Aristotle. Author Jae-oh Ahn from South Korea. 1. The scope and task of first philosophy. Metaphysics, historically designated as first philosophy, is the fundamental discipline that moves beyond visible, individual objects to investigate the unchanging, eternal structure of being as being to Ahn Jae-oh. The term metaphysics was assigned after Aristotle's death, when his disciples organized his extensive treatises, carrying the literal, meaning the study that comes after physics nature. It was later systematically categorized by Andronicus of Rhodes, the 11th head of the peripatetic school. Metaphysics divides into two main branches. General metaphysics, ontology, the inquiry into the fundamental principles of being in general, and eternal immutable existence. Special metaphysics, the investigation of transcendent entities, such as God, the soul, and human freedom. Since Immanuel Kant, modern philosophy has frequently dismissed metaphysics as a dogmatic, unscientific endeavor. However, this critique remains one-sided, targeting strictly special metaphysics, which functions merely as an applied field. The primary objective of this work is to refute postmodern anti-metaphysical tendencies and demonstrate the enduring, foundational necessity of general metaphysics. Aristotle explained reality through hylomorphism, the doctrine that every individual substance consists of a compound of matter, heel and form morpha, matter represents dynamis, potency, or potentiality, the capacity to become something, while form represents energeia. Actuality, the realization of that potential. All motion, generation, and natural phenomena are teleological processes, wherein potentiality gains form and culminates in actuality. The ultimate cause and final end of this process is the unmoved mover, pure actuality. The historical trajectory of metaphysics initiated with Parmenides, developed through Plato, and reached completion in Aristotle's Metaphysics and Evolution, reflecting what Hegel described as the tremendous labor of the world spirit. Applying the German methodology of developmental history, Entwicklungsgeschichte, this study draws from critical insights gained during Professor K. Dusing's seminar at the University of Cologne. The author's early life, losing his father at age 6 and experiencing profound isolation. Moving between Gwangju and Busan sparked early philosophical inquiries into identity and difference, and being and non-being. Following graduate studies at Seoul National University, conversion to Christianity deepened this perceptual framework through theological reflection, even while engaging in physical labor, to support his research in establishing the founding committee for the Educational Republic Party. To address national demographic decline through educational reform, the systematic pursuit of ontology remained paramount. In Machinanant, Sophistic 2, Parmenides and the foundation of ontology. Parmenides of Elea stands as the decisive pioneer of Western ontology, for being the first to isolate and reflect upon being itself, rejecting early pre-Socratic natural philosophies that sought principles of change within physical elements. He declared the foundational axiom, what is what is not being exists, and non-being does not exist. For Parmenides, being contains no negation, only absolute affirmation exists. Everyday concepts such as destruction or non-existence do not denote actual annihilation, but merely convenient linguistic expressions, indicating the separation of existing entities. By declaring that thinking and being are the same, Parmenides established that reality cannot be grasped through sensory perception, but solely through rational thought and language. This directly dismantled Gorgias's skeptical trilemma. Nothing exists if it exists. It cannot be known if known. It cannot be communicated and asserted. Human reason as the sole criterion of truth. Earlier thinkers, Thales and Anaximenes, accepted generation and decay, attempting to explain physical causes. However, assertions that air perishes into water fall into the logical fallacy of presupposing non-being. Parmenides asserted that generation and destruction are sensory illusions. Belonging to doxa opinion, though he held physical limitations by conceptualizing being as a spatial spherical body, he established the fundamental distinction between the sensible world, sensation, and the intelligible world, thought. His doctrine of immutable being laid the groundwork for pluralists such as Empedocles, four elements, Democritus atomism, and Plato forms to explain macroscopic change via immutable microscopic elements. 3. Reconsidering Plato's dialogues. The centrality of the Theaetetus. utilizing developmental history and Entwicklungsgeschichte. This work presents a re-evaluation of Plato's dialogue chronology. The bridge to the forms. Plato moved beyond early Socratic aporia to construct the Republic. By synthesizing Heraclitus's theory of universal flux panterai with Parmenides' immutable being, securing absolute knowledge through the form idea. Chronological reassignment among the four dialogues. Traditionally classified as late, only the Theaetetus belongs to Plato's middle period, written directly prior to the Republic. To address the limits of perception and judgment, Aristotelian authorship of late dialogues. The remaining three dialogues, Parmenides, Sophist, and Statesman, are properly understood as works authored by Aristotle. Arguments in the Parmenides, such as the third man, argument and analogy of the sale, completely devastate the theory of forms. Crucially, while Socrates leads genuine Platonic dialogues, these three works feature an Iliadic visitor, or an elderly Parmenides, dominating a young Socrates. This dramatic setup contradicts Plato's reverence for his master, exposing instead Aristotle's early efforts to overcome Platonic idealism. Aristotle resolved the conflict between form and particular by establishing substance and attribute. He redefined forms not as transcendent, separately existing entities, but as immanent universal concepts shared by individual substances. Thus, metaphysics progressed from Parmenides' immutable ontology through Plato's idealism to Aristotle's hylomorphism. 4. Epistemological inquiry in Plato's Theaetetus. The Theaetetus opens with a frame narrative, where Euclides reads to Terpsion, an account of young Theaetetus studying under Socrates. Commemorating Theaetetus after his mortal wounding in the Corinthian War, the text shifts from Socratic practical ethics apology, credo, to theoretical epistemology, while Karl Popper correctly identified its early to middle placement. Against late dialogue misclassifications, the Theaetetus functions specifically as a middle dialogue, analyzing cognitive methodology prior to the Republic. Moreover, Socrates demonstrates deep reverence for Parmenides in the Theaetetus. Unlike the critical treatment found in the Parmenides or Sophists, the dialogue's primary target is the empiricism and relativism of Protagoras. First definition: knowledge is sensible perception. Theaetetus proposes that knowledge is perception, mirroring Hegel's sensory certainty. However, because sensory experiences vary between individuals, wind feeling cold to one person and warm to another, perception remains strictly subjective. Protagoras formalized this as homo mensura, man is the measure of all things. This reduced truth to individual preference, supplying sophists with commercialized rhetoric to win courtroom disputes. Socrates contrasts this commercialism with Thales, who fell into a ditch while observing the stars mocked by a Thracian servant girl for ignoring what lay at his feet. Plato links Protagoras' relativism with Heraclitus's flux theory, everything flows. Though Heraclitus emphasized rational logos over sense data, Plato invoked flux to contrast the unstable physical world with Parmenides' immovable being. In the Republic, Plato synthesizes these worlds by assigning immovable being to the forms and flux to sensible particulars. Ahn Jae-oh is refutation of perception knowledge. Socrates demonstrates that if individual perception dictates truth, no distinction exists between a professor and an uneducated person, or even a human and an animal. If all judgments are correct, learning is obsolete in Protagoras' paid. Educational enterprise collapses into self-contradiction. Ultimately, subjective empiricism degenerates into cognitive anarchy and power dynamics. Calicles' justice is the interest of the stronger. The mind is the unifying center. Sensory organs are mere instruments analogous to warriors inside the Trojan horse. Cognition requires a central, unifying subject to process disparate inputs from eyes and ears. Plato identifies this subject as the soul mind. The mind operates using non-sensory categories: being, non-being, identity, difference, likeness, unlikeness, opposition, comparison. These categories are not physical properties of external objects, but independent operations of the intellect. Knowledge arises only when input is structured into a judgment. This object is an apple. By demonstrating that the soul operates independently of physical sensory organs, Plato established the foundation for mind-body dualism and transcendental idealism, prefiguring Kant's transcendental apperception and the integrated sensus communis. Namasha 5. Error and the paradox of learning. Common opinion assumes error consists in thinking what is not. Influenced by Parmenides, Plato rejects this. Thinking non-being is impossible, Socrates, therefore making a false judgment, is different from thinking what is not. Error is not mere imagination. It is false judgment regarding what is mistaking existing object. A for existing object B. This reflects Parmenides' axiom that thinking and being are bound together. Plato reassesses sensation's role. While sensation alone is not complete knowledge, its direct reception of reality is valid. What is seen or touched exists as real data. Error occurs not within raw sensation or pure thought, but in the faulty combination of thought and sensation. Shepard. 1. The analogy of the wax tablet. To explain how errors occur, Socrates introduces the wax tablet. Socrates. Imagine that there is in our souls a block of wax, a gift of Mnemosyne, the mother of the muses. Whenever we wish to remember something, we hold this wax under perceptions and thoughts and imprint them upon it, as with seal rings. External objects act as seal rings, leaving impressions on mental wax. This model prefigures David Hume's theory of impressions and ideas, as well as modern concepts of neuroplasticity. Knowing and learning are not creation out of nothing non-being, but transitions from one state of being to another. Error occurs when a current sensory input is incorrectly matched with a past wax impression, identifying error as the miscoupling of sensation and memory. Solve the immediate problem of false judgment, even as the ultimate criteria, for absolute truth required the full formulation of the forms. Sirpernuraya 1. 2. The Theaetetus and the paradox of learning. In the Theaetetus, the Sophist brothers, Dionysiodorus and Theaetetus, construct an heuristic dilemma against the Cleinias. Theaetetus, Cleinias, are those who learn the wise or the ignorant? If Cleinias answers the wise, the Sophists object that learners do not yet possess knowledge. If he answers the ignorant, they declare that the unlearned cannot acquire wisdom. This encapsulates Meno's paradox. Inquiring into what one knows is unnecessary, while inquiring into what one does not know is impossible because one lacks the criteria to recognize it. Socrates resolves the dilemma by distinguishing two senses of learning. 1. Acquiring new knowledge previously unknown. 2. Understanding newly acquired data through pre-existing cognitive structures. The Sophists further abuse Parmenides' being-non-being dichotomy to assert that lies do not exist. They argued that to speak a lie is to speak what is not non-being. But since non-being cannot be spoken, all speech expresses what is and is therefore true. Socrates exposes the absurdity of this claim. If lies are impossible, false thought is impossible, meaning no one can be ignorant. But if no one is ignorant, the Sophists' own commercial enterprise of teaching wisdom becomes meaningless. By exposing their arguments as mere verbal acrobatics, Socrates defeated their sophistry, clearing the path for a rigorous ontology grounded in rational judgment. Structural hylomorphism in first philosophy. Commercial 1. The allegory of the aviary possession versus having of knowledge. The problems of learning and lying left unresolved in the Theaetetus receive a sophisticated philosophical answer. Through the allegory of the aviary in the Theaetetus, Plato separates knowledge into having, soyu, and possession, sochi, having purchasing clothes and storing them in a closet, a trace or memory preserved in the mind, possessing, actually wearing those clothes, activating and applying perception and thought corresponding to that memory. In this allegory, the aviary signifies the human soul or memory storage. While the birds represent individual pieces of knowledge, the vessel starts empty in youth. Catching a bird and placing it in the enclosure constitutes knowledge acquisition. This model shatters both the daily phenomenon of not perceiving what one knows and the sophistic dichotomy of knowledge versus ignorance, recalling and using acquired. Knowledge catching a bird inside the coop is the second meaning of learning. 1. First learning receiving a new external object and storing it in the mind wax tablet analogy. 2. Your second learning, recapturing and activating stored knowledge as needed aviary allegory. Error occurs when one pulls the wrong concept out of memory, like intending to grab a domestic pigeon, but accidentally seizing a wild one. However, this model introduces a new epistemological dilemma. While empirical mistakes involve shared concepts confusing two types of birds, pure mathematical errors, e.g. judging $56.12 remain difficult to explain. Plato leaves the necessary and sufficient conditions for true knowledge, open-ended yet illuminates the nature of sensation, thought, memory, and judgment. 2. Development of Platonic epistemology and ontology. 1. Epistemological aporia Plato attempts to explain how ignorance replaces knowledge in the soul through the aviary. However, within Parmenides' dichotomy, what is what is not, harboring knowledge and ignorance simultaneously within a single soul entails a logical contradiction, pushing epistemology into aporia. 2. Inference knowledge logos as an alternative to judgment knowledge. Plato introduces inference knowledge, correct judgment, accompanied by an account logos. Knowledge requires combining sensory material with rational linguistic forms, analyzing components like the 100 timber pieces of a war chariot, yet this still fails to yield an absolute criterion of truth. 3. The ontological turn in the Republic. To overcome subjectivity and sophistic value relativism, homo mensura Thrasymachus's interest of the stronger, Plato grounds reality and immutable forms ideas. In politics, justice is defined as harmony across the tripartite soul and three state classes. Led by a philosopher king, the world is divided via the analogy of the divided line visible versus intelligible realms culminating in the form of the good. Allegory of the cave. 4. Expansion and internal fissures in the Phaedo. Mind-body dualism defines learning as recollection, anamnesis, the soul-reviving forms seen before bodily incarnation. However, participation theory faces the paradox of the large and small. If Simmias is larger than Socrates but smaller than Phaedo, the forms of largeness and smallness would absurdly coexist in a single person. Treating relational concepts as independent substances exposed. Structural flaws. Driving Aristotle's categories. The Sophist and the Aristotelian turn. To refute the Sophistic claim that falsehood's non-being cannot exist, the Sophist demonstrates that non-being exists as difference otherness. The shift in dialogue leadership from Socrates to the Eleatic visitor suggests an intentional staging by Aristotle to resolve Platonic epistemological dilemmas. 3. The identity of the Sophist and the critique of Parmenides. Using the method of division diaresis, Plato traces the identity of sophists across production and acquisition arts. Sophists are defined as hunters of young men, merchants of knowledge, and makers of phantasms, who trade in apparent knowledge for tuition rather than truth. Defining the sophist as a teacher of falsehood requires refuting Parmenides' prohibition against speaking non-being. The Eleatic visitor commits symbolic parricide against Parmenides through 3 critiques: self-contradiction, using the phrase that which does not exist, contradicts asserting it cannot be spoken. Dilemma of monism, positing the one while using the terms being, and one implies a plurality of name and reality. Static limits, depicting being as a static physical sphere, isolates the concept of the one. By redefining non-being as difference alterity, the negative prefix miux signifies something other, rather than absolute annihilation. Not large means small or medium. C. Kenmerm. The Rudshirker 4, category motion, dialectic, and propositional logic. Highest kinds being, difference, motion, rest, combine and separate according to specific logical rules. Dialectic, the systematic discipline that clarifies permissible category combinations. Propositions formed by combining subject and predicate. Truth or falsehood depends on alignment with reality. True proposition, Theaetetus is sitting, combines existing facts. False proposition, Theaetetus is flying incorrectly, combines what is not as if it were. Falsehood is not absolute nothingness, but a faulty combination of subject and predicate. Regarding aesthetics, Plato Republic dismissed art as an imitation of an imitation, 2 steps removed from the forms. Conversely, Aristotle Poetics validated imitation as a natural cognitive process, distinguishing valid representation from false phantasms. 5. The Parmenides and the deconstruction of the forms. Textual and philological analysis suggests late dialogues like the Parmenides reflect Aristotle's systematic critique of Plato. Part 1 dismantles the forms through key arguments. Critique mechanism, logical failure, implication. Low-level forms, inability to explain forms. For trivial items, hair, mud, dirt. Third man argument. Assuming self-predication creates an infinite regress, requiring a third form to unite an individual man in the form of man. Analogy of the sale. Physically dividing a form across particulars destroys its unified oneness. Master-slave analogy. Master-slave dynamics are historical, interdependent statuses, not transcendent, forms hold no causal power over physical particulars. In Part 2, the dialogue explores the one and the many through paradoxical propositions. Parmenides asserts that the one is not equal to itself or to another, nor is it different from another. This yields 4 contradictory claims. This exercises logical fallacies such as confusing becoming equal with equality itself to verify truth through contradiction, establishing the foundation for Aristotle's law of non-contradiction. When treating the one exists, asserting that the one partakes in existence splits the one into spatial parts, causing a collapse from unity into infinite number. This proves that transcendent, detached ideas cannot account for concrete substances. Geoffrey Number 6 conclusion. Aristotle's synthesis of first philosophy. Aristotle transformed the transcendent ideas into immanent concepts, embedded within physical reality. 1. Substance ousia. Primary substances are real individual entities, while forms operate as universals, qualities, and immanent essences. 2. Hylomorphism and teleology. Change is explained through matter dynamis, potentiality, actualizing into form energeia, actuality driven by an telos. 3. The unmoved mover. To avoid infinite regress, Aristotle posits pure actuality as the prime cause, an ultimate final cause of cosmic motion. Werner Jaeger argued that Aristotle's metaphysics contained an internal contradiction, shifting from early theology to late universal ontology. However, this evolution is better understood as a dialectical integration. Theological aspect, xenophonic element inquiry, into the transcendent primary cause God. Ontological aspect, Parmenidean element, universal study of being as being. First philosophy becomes universal ontology, precisely through the dignity of the primary substance. By reinterpreting negation as propositional combination and separation, Aristotle resolved Parmenides' paradox of nothingness, distinguished primary substances from dependent attributes, and provided the structural foundation for Western empirical science and first philosophy.